Welcome to Tiski Sour. Today we're going to be talking about one of the biggest issues facing Britain right now. Every left-winger worth their salt has given their hot take today of all days, in fact. What is the best pancake topping? To join me, I've got David Waring, an expert on all issues sweet and savoury, and Eleanor Penny, the fruitiest among us.
Disappointed.
David, what's your favourite?
Strawberry jam, I think.
All right.
Yeah.
That's weird. I didn't even know that gets put on pancakes.
I've never heard that kind of deviance
really nice.
live on air before.
It's really nice. Why are you looking at me like that?
I don't know.
The sheer contempt, like radiating from every fibre of my being. No, I think it's less like quality. I more go for quantity. I've had so many pancakes I can feel them coagulating in like the fibres of my brain.
I haven't had any yet.
I like that. I respect that answer. It's more about quantity than quality. Or did you do the other way around?
No, I've absolute quantity.
It's all about quantity, all right. I'm lemon and sugar.
No one asked.
Borderline health food.
Yeah, what's yours? Lemon and sugar.
Yeah, it don't matter. It's just, I don't expect people to ask me questions. All right. We're not actually talking about pancakes. We're talking about racism. In fact, we are talking about racism in Britain's two major parties: the anti-Semitism row in Labour and Islamophobia in the Tories. We're also going to talk about the concept of institutional racism, which is coming up a lot at the moment, and I think is being widely misunderstood. As you already know, I'm joined by David Waring, author of Anglo-Arabia, Why Gulf Wealth Matters to Britain. And I'm also joined by Eleanor Penny, senior editor at Novara Media. We are going to start with anti-Semitism and the left, because you always have to start by getting your own house in order. This is back in the news. It's back in the news because last week, Chris Williamson, MP, a video of him came out speaking to a Momentum meeting in Sheffield, where he was arguing that Labour had apologised too much for anti-Semitism and got a rapturous round of applause. That created a sort of 24-hour news story and a lot of pressure for him to be suspended after, it was unsure what was going to happen, and then he was suspended. I personally was in favour of it, even though Chris Williamson is a friend. I've always thought in many ways he was an excellent MP, but this was just... The dude had not shown any willingness to learn about the pain he was causing, and he was adding fuel to the fire in a way that was really unhelpful. And I don't say that in the sense of optics. I've heard lots of people on Twitter, lots of people on the left saying, people who've thrown Chris Williamson under the bus for optics, you're never going to get good press, so what's the point? I think if you were to support the suspension of someone for optics, that would be terrible. But I don't think this is about optics. This is about being responsible. And not just responsible in terms of the press, being responsible in the sense of guaranteeing that the Labour Party is a safe space for Jewish people, which means that you can't really just dismiss those problems and feed into a cycle, which is deeply unhelpful and also kind of harmful. I think. Eleanor Penny, what do you think? I
mean, I largely agree with you. I think the harm of Chris Williamson's comments comes from when, or how those comments galvanise and legitimise and mobilise a growing caucus of people who are taking some understandable frustration with media hammering of the Corbyn project and allowing that to toxify into a total unwillingness to confront honestly the ways in which the Labour Party is deeply imbricated with this country's very old, very stymied history of racism in all forms. And in some ways I think this is very much to do with the ways in which the Labour Party membership isn't mobilised in other ways, right? We're seeing a kind of period of stagnation, of frustration, and those kinds of energies are being channeled into these really unhelpful, dangerous kinds of forms, which are simply about reclaiming a sense of agency and reclaiming a sense of, I guess, sort of moral purity or moral superiority to the kind of Tory press or whoever you're kind of you think is witch hunting you or whatever. But really this is very, very damaging to the project long term, not only because it is massively disrespectful to Jewish people in Labour, not only because it inculcates real harm, it kind of glosses over the fact that we have rising levels of anti-Semitism and violent hate crimes of all kinds in this country, not only because it fails to win over the kind of centre ground or whatever that we need to win over if we're going to mount a successful electoral campaign, but because it's always seems to be couched in this idea that Labour is an anti-racist party, which is a massive simplification at best, and at worst, you know, untrue and irresponsible. I mean, just...
You have to make that argument. You can't just repeat it, can you?
Yeah, just like a month ago, the Labour Party failed to whip against the Tory immigration bill. Complete dereliction of duty. Sarah Champion was not disciplined.
Let's keep to
in the same
anti-Semitism
way.
for now. We'll move on to sort of like all the other ways
these
Labour
things
is
are-
racist in
No,
a
but
little
these
in a
things
little
are
while.
linked up. That's what I'm saying. That anti-Semitism is a way of mobilising and legitimising other forms of racism. That's why we can't just talk about Labour anti-Semitism versus Tory Islamophobia, because they are very much bound up together. They're both ways of expressing this sense of manufactured crisis in terms of how the West sees itself.
There was a lot going on there. David, do you think the anti-Semitism crisis or row, or whatever we want to call it, problem, it's definitely a problem, in the Labour Party is related to how the West sees itself?
I think all these racisms are connected, and that's really important. And we have to see the struggle against racism, anti-Semitism within the left and within Labour, and the struggle against Islamophobia in the Tory party as battles in a wider war against racism in British society, rather than, and this is, I'm worried that as a left, and you know, we're going down a road of saying, yeah, we've got anti-Semites in our ranks, you know, we've finally been persuaded we should be concerned about that, but look at them lot, they've got far more racists in their ranks, and it's becoming a kind of a kind of form of retaliation and deflection. And that, if we don't like the idea of people weaponising racism for political ends, then we really shouldn't be doing that, because that's almost instrumentalising the pain of Muslim people by using it as a way of kicking back against accusations that are made against us as a left. So we've really got to avoid that.
Where was this energy a month ago, right?
Yeah.
Where was this mass movement in the kind of white elements of the Labour Party to be so concerned about Islamophobia in this country, right? It was nowhere.
Yeah.
Or I don't want to say it was nowhere, but it was very much diminished. And I'm very glad that finally it seems like we're actually analysing the ways in which Islamophobia is not just a particular problem with individual Tories, but very much foundational to the Tory project, and very much about trying to legitimise broader domestic and foreign policy aims.
I want to go on to Islamophobia in a sec. I think we should just... I mean, I know all the issues are connected, but you can also talk about them somewhat separately. They're not all the same, right? Yeah.
Sure, but I'm concerned about the ways in which, just as anti-Semitism has been weaponised by the right, Islamophobia is being weaponised by the left, and ultimately the well-being of Jewish and Muslim people is not being examined as an urgent point of crisis,
and an interconnected thing as well.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, it's important, I think, that we foreground our discussion with the fact that these battles are not to be played off against each other. They're all interconnected. British racism is a widespread, deeply entrenched thing at the level of policy, discourse, institutions, and all these things are connected. So if we're going to talk about Islamophobia in the Tory party, if we're going to talk about anti-Semitism in Labour, let's talk about it in those terms. I think that was a really important point you were making at the beginning, that these things are all tied together. It's good to start off with that and then get into more detail.
Yeah, I'm going to put out... I'm not that convinced how similar they are and how tied together they are. So I mean, I know the media have tried to put forward this idea that anti-Semitism in Labour is something that's specific to the left, and sort of like at the extremes that ends up with this argument that anti-capitalism essentially always merges into anti-Semitism, which was an argument put forward by, I think, Siobhan McDonough, MP is her name. We'll talk about that issue more thoroughly in a moment. And I think that's somewhat ridiculous. I do think on the fringes of the far left, as the fringes of the far right, or just the fringes of politics generally, you will end up with some cranky conspiracy theorists who believe odd stuff about the Rothschilds, who believe odd stuff about Zionists controlling the world, etc., etc., etc. What I think is specific about anti-Semitism on the left, and this is something this is a conclusion I've come to quite recently, which has sort of like made me reassess how I've interpreted this whole mess, is I do think people on the left right now are more willing to dismiss anti-Semitism than they are other forms of racism. That's not society-wide, and I think that is specific to the left for two reasons. One, that we've seen Jeremy Corbyn being attacked and attacked and attacked and attacked for 3 years. It's clear that the establishment are trying to bring him down, and so when anti-Semitism forms a part of those attacks, we sort of have a habitual response, which is to say, no, nonsense. And I think that has meant that we haven't taken it as seriously as we should have done. Mm-hmm. And I think, secondly, people on the left and people who've been activists on the pro-Palestine left, which Corbyn has been, which many people who have come to this project have been, they know that sometimes accusations of anti-Semitism are made on really quite tenuous and spurious grounds to try and delegitimise anything more than the most mild criticism of Israel. And so what that has made people do is quite unresponsive to it. It's like, oh, of course they're calling me an anti-Semite again, because they've called me an anti-Semite when I advocated for Palestine XYZ times before. And I think what that has made is a specific problem in the Labour Party, which isn't similar to how it relates to other forms of racism, which is when someone says that's anti-Semitic, everyone goes, oh, you know, and that's why you're seeing these motions defending Chris Williamson, which is saying there is no institutional anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. There is no, like, this is not a problem. And however many Jewish people say it is, it's just a shutting down of that debate because people have their ears and eyes closed. And I think that is specific to the left, actually. And I do think that is a very different dynamic to how Islamophobia plays out in Britain, for example. That doesn't mean it's more serious, but I think it's different.
I mean, I think yes and no, right? Because clearly there is a massive unwillingness to honestly tackle anti-Semitism in the left. Like, I've been in meetings with Labour Party members where someone said, I was suspended, and they got a round of applause, right? That is gut-wrenching and horrible and makes me, you know, honestly very sympathise for people who are just tapping out and being like, you know what, I'm done. Mm-hmm. However, I also think that when we exceptionalise the ways in which left-wing people dismiss anti-Semitism, we miss a trick, because we miss the extent to which the right dismisses anti-Semitism by getting into bed with far-right fascist anti-Semites, who aren't expressing their anti-Semitism in the same way, but are similarly willing to sign off on the same kind of like reactionary conspiracy theories, and similarly willing to put their weight behind very dangerous, very violent political conclusions, right? But I also think that I don't think that anti-Semitism is unique in the left's sort of propensity to dismiss it, because, as I've mentioned before, the left is very, very willing, perhaps not to dismiss, but certainly to sideline issues of race when it comes to things like triangulating this quote-unquote sort of imaginary white working class votes. And in order to capture that vote, the logic goes, or the dominant sort of knowledge goes, that you need to not talk about race, you need to not talk about demolishing borders, you need to try and play to a kind of authentic white working class racism, which is not how racism works, really, because, you know, racism is an elite project and is just as prevalent, if not more prevalent, among the middle classes and the upper classes. It ignores the fact that many people of colour are working class. You are more likely to be working class if you are a person of colour, and also just fundamentally morally compromises your project and tactically compromises your project, because, as we've seen, the giving ground on these kinds of issues of migration and race has opened the door for the kind of policies that we're now seeing, and a sort of generalisation of the dominant logic of, you know, the kind of migration policies that Theresa May is pushing for, right? That's the kind of thing that is dismissed by the left. Paul Mason was saying that we need to prioritise the growth of places like Skipton over the growth of places like Shanghai. Yeah. That is racism that is dismissed by the left. And that is why I think exceptionalising anti-Semitism and not drawing the links between anti-Semitism and all forms of racism does a disservice to Jewish people, because if you're not diagnosing the problem correctly, how the hell are you going to solve it?
What do you think, David?
I think there's a couple of ways in which, in addition to what else is said, I think there's a couple of ways in which you can draw connections between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. I mean, I feel like if we as a left learn from this experience, learn how this racism is manifesting itself within our movement, you can take lessons from that and apply them to forms of racism that we find elsewhere in society. So I really think fighting these individual battles helps us fight a wider war. What's happening so look at anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and you can see similar themes playing out. This sinister other, which is a threat to the nation. What does anti-Semitism look like historically in Europe? Jewish people portrayed as an Oriental other, separate from the nation, a sinister kind of threat to its security and what have you. Themes I see from my experiences as a person of colour with racism, the denialism. You point it out and people don't want to hear it. And people have themselves down as good, enlightened people who would never do anything racist or say anything racist. So, where are you getting this from? And then you see Jewish people raising it in the labour movement and facing that denialism, and you recognise it. And the same thing happens with Islamophobia. The lack of literacy around these things is really important. The fact that people don't understand fundamentally what racism is and how it works, and that's leading us in the left to not diagnose it when we see it, not recognise it when we see it, in the same way as people on the right aren't diagnosing and recognising their Islamophobia. And more broadly in society, the way people don't really get what racism is and how it works.
What is racism?
So I think the problem we have in the left often, I say we, other bits of the left, is we often see racism as the misdirected economic concerns of an ignorant working class. And if only we redistributed wealth, people would magically stop being racist. And if only we did better political education, people would stop being racist. And we see it as an individual pathology. Individuals have this. Sometimes we talk about anti-Semitism as a virus, that's infested society or something like that. Okay, but it's not about individual pathologies coming out as negative speech acts, or speech acts do matter. This stuff is institutionalised, and it comes from the top. Like the dominant ideology and dominant discourse in the society is produced and reproduced by the people at the top. It's not produced and reproduced by the people below, because they tend not to have a voice. Racism against people of colour, Islamophobia, comes in the context of empire. How do we, as an elite group, as a ruling class, justify forms of violence and domination over people who we perceive racially as different from us? Well, we tell ourselves that they're inferior, and we're actually doing this stuff for their own good, So you have political, economic and power relations in terms of imperialism and stuff like that, and then you have an ideology that grows out of that and then informs how those structures formulate themselves and how they manifest themselves. So I think there's loads we can learn from that. If we understand racism and how it works in that more kind of institutionalised, structural way, and less as individual pathologies, then we can tackle all these different kinds of racism, I think. We can draw lessons from one and apply them to another.
And I think picking up on the role of colonialism and our kind of historical illiteracy in terms of the way in which British people especially mostly don't know about our colonial history, because that's been completely excised from the public conversation and purposefully excised from a lot of school textbooks. And also our just kind of general embarrassment about it. Like, we hate talking about it other than to say that it was the greatest thing in the world, but don't ask me any more questions, right? And that's very bound up with the way in which a lot of people on the left kind of drink the Kool-Aid when it comes to thinking that the interests of Jewish people are one and the same as the interests of the Israeli state. Because if you don't really know much about the history of British colonialism, it's easy to believe, like, Netanyahu's agitprop to say that, like, this is the Jewish state, I speak for all Jewish people. because you have no idea that Israel is and was a British colonial project constructed by and to secure the colonial interests of the British state by people who were in government with people who were so anti-Semitic that they were turning away Holocaust victims and Holocaust refugees. And that holds true today as well. When we look at the forces who are supporting Israeli settler colonial projects, that's not, Jewish lobbies sort of sowing their influence in UK and US politics. It's because Israeli policies align with foreign policy goals of the UK and the US. And to talk about AIPAC or Jewish lobbies as these kind of singular explanatory factors for the imbrication of the US and the UK in Israeli politics completely misses a trick, because you're completely ignoring why their interests would be aligned in the first place. The biggest sort of Zionist, if you like, lobby in the US is the Republican Party, and it's a kind of groundswell of evangelical Christians, partly mobilised by political allegiances, and there is this kind of latent justification that we should support the Jewish people, who are kind of bad because they're not white, but they're not as bad as the Muslims who are really bad, those kinds of layered racisms. But it's also because of an evangelical kind of sort of, I'm going to say, mythology, that in order to hurry the end of days, the Jewish people should be returned to the homeland, and on that day, when all of the Jewish people are returned to the homeland, then the rapture will come, and all of the good Christians will be raptured up, and the Jews will have one last chance to convert, and if not, they'll be sent to hell. That is a very, very anti-Semitic ideology, and it's driving a lot of Zionism, both from the top down in terms of material foreign policy goals, and from the bottom up in terms of a kind of cultural superstition around Jewish people. So we shouldn't be surprised when we find a lot of the most powerful Zionists in the world, Donald Trump being one of them, also allying themselves with anti-Semites. Like, this is not a contradiction in terms as it's often treated. And so when left-wing people talk about Jewish interests and Israeli interests being one and the same, I get obviously very frustrated, because A, it's just factually inaccurate. In any kind of survey of Jewish people, you will get people even who support the project of the State of Israel who are critical of their policies, much more critical than someone in like Labour Friends of Israel, for instance, would be. But also because that's what Netanyahu wants you to think, right? It's so useful for those kinds of policy goals that that the left, in their resistance to colonial projects and in their support of the Palestinian people, would essentially agree with the propaganda of the Israeli state. It is madness.
There's an element of Netanyahu's kind of narrative, I think, which is probably relevant here, and it's Netanyahu and people around him, in that he always tries to code Israel effectively as white. So Israel is an outpost of Western civilization. This is Netanyahu's kind of, and people, I'm using Netanyahu as a kind of stand-in for the Israeli right generally. So Israel is an outpost of Western civilization, and we're in a tough neighbourhood. And it just really unsubtly racialised language. Basically, we're surrounded by brown people, barbarians at the gates, extremist, pathological Jew haters, and we're the bastions of your civilization, Europe and America, so stand with us. So it's an attempt to code Israel as white. And I think a problem, and Rachel Shabby's written something really good on this in The Guardian back in September, a problem that we've had in the left, because you were talking earlier about why we don't face up to this stuff. In addition to what you were saying, I think she really hits on something important. The problem we've had in the left is that too often we've coded Jewish people as white, unthinkingly. And I'm not sure we should be taking our cues from people like Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, Jewish people are part of black and minority ethnic, and we've failed, I think, as a left to recognise that.
Do you think there's... So I was listening to an entertaining podcast called The Bituation Room, which is hosted by what's her name? Anyway, one of the guests was
her.
One of the guests was Fiorentina. Her second name is Fiorentina. I can't remember what her first name is. Francesca Fiorentina.
There we go.
And Matt Lieb was on it, who's someone I know, a Jewish guy who you've interviewed in the United States.
The lovely Matt Lieb.
And he was asked, are Jewish people white? And he said, well, white Jews are white. To sort of laughter in the audience. But I mean, it kind of, I feel like there are two elements of this. And I do feel like something that, obviously, I don't know what you think, Eleanor. I mean, you're the only Jewish person in the room, but I think Jews can benefit from white privilege, and that has fed into some of the confusion as to the debate around anti-Semitism. Because I mean, I've spoken to BAME people who feel like one of the reasons the anti-Semitism crisis in Labour gets more media attention than, say, Islamophobia in the Tories is because the media love attacking Labour, but it's also that the media are more sympathetic to the Jewish cause than Muslims because they code Jewish people as white.
Yeah, I think this is an important point to pick up on, particularly in terms of linking the kind of character of the Israeli state with the flaws in taking its diagnoses as to what does and doesn't count as anti-Semitism particularly seriously, right? Because the Israeli state persecutes Jewish people as well, people from say Mizrahi backgrounds and Eritrean Jewish people.
Well, that's why Matt Lieb said white Jews are white, right?
Well, precisely. I think there are kind of it's sort of a tenuous question because it's very much related to where you are in the world and your relation to other kinds of racial categories, right? On a very simple analysis of kind of white passingness or the colour of your skin. Yes, there are many hundreds of thousands of Jewish people who are not white. You have Iranian Jewish people and you have black Jewish people and you have Jewish people of all kinds of backgrounds, right? And the fact that Ashkenazi, aka sort of Northern European origin Jewish people, are the people we think and talk about when we talk about Jewish people, has a lot to do with the fact that those are the populations who are most represented in the UK and the US, but also a lot to do with the fact that a lot of people kind of look white and who are kind of more tolerable to or seem more tolerable to white society. But I think there's kind of something slightly more complex going on about the relationship of whiteness to Jewishness, which is because the particular character of anti-Semitism is a lot about like identifying, capturing and deflecting what should be a criticism of the white capitalist class onto a racialized other, right? Because if you were to say there is a group of people largely of a homogenous ethnicity who control vast amounts of power and wealth and who are therefore able to manipulate world politics such as to preserve their power, you'll be right, but that's rich white people, right? And there is this kind of like close imbrication of like the language in which a lot of people understand Jewishness with the material reality of what it means to be white. And a lot of Ashkenazi people also on a sort of slightly tangential note are properly white. And I count myself like that. I'm like 100%. I'm 100% white bread in many ways, because it's about a particular relation to state power and it's about a particular relation to resources, right? But in other ways, there's more of a question mark there, because whiteness is also about a relationship to violence and to the kinds of legitimate violence that can be done to you, right? And so I don't think we can, if we are to say that no Jewish people are white, we end up sort of flattening the distinctions and kind of running roughshod over the difficulties of Jewish people of colour and Mizrahi and Sephardi Jewish people. But we also need to pay attention to the ways in which the kind of adoption of Jewishness within the kind of like temple of whiteness is a very, very recent phenomenon and very much bound up with, as we've been saying, like particular domestic and foreign policy goals within within US and UK and like Western that society, as David was pointing out, it's got a lot to do with the relationship with how Israel portrays itself and why that picture is convenient to us.
So you say, well, what Matt Lieb's called white Jews are sort of contingently white. So sort of like they're BAME in the sense that they sort of have this vulnerability that at any moment, or they can be subject to racism in a way that I can't be subject to racism. I'm just a white guy who no one's racist against me because I don't have any minority status. I mean, they could hate me because I'm gay, but I mean they don't normally bother.
So many other reasons.
They hate me for all sorts of reasons, to be honest, but they're not for protected characteristics. Let's talk about. Yeah, let's go on to this anti-capitalism, anti-Semitism thing. So this is one meme which has emerged.
One thing coming out of what else, because just to underline there was so much complexity in there, and that I think the lesson to draw from that is, I think sometimes this seems obvious, or we take it for granted, those of us on the left, but I don't think it's widely understood and stressed enough that race is a social construct. Mm-hmm. I think it's too often seen as a biological fact or an inherent fact that people have within themselves, and not something that's constructed, produced, reproduced, and that shifts in terms of discourse and state policy and what have you. And people still say Islam is not a race. Supposedly educated people still say Islam is not a race, and then you have to say, well, okay, what is a race? So having that discussion about how racism actually works, how people get racialized, I think it seems obvious sometimes to some of us on the left, but we do need to keep having it. We do need to keep saying it.
There's a brilliant sort of scholarship on how the Irish became white in the United States. So they used to be seen, I suppose, not as black. I don't know what they referred to, but as foreign and subject to racism. And then sort of over the decades and generations, they became white Americans. So it's sort of like a good example of how race can be socially constructed. I don't know if the Irish feel like it can be withdrawn at any point in the United States, I suppose, because of the level of integration, they're less so.
I think this point about the potential for your white card to be rescinded at any moment is very important when understanding the kind of bunker mentality, the kind of crisis mentality amongst some Jewish people I've talked to, like maybe older people in my family, who are still living with the generationally very recent memories of mass genocide, right? Let's not underpeddle it. And this stuff has real charged generational memories. Like in Jewish assembly at school, I was 7 or 8 years old, being shown pictures of like emaciated people when the camps were liberated. Right. This is how this is my heritage of this is how I understand political violence in many ways. It's linked back to those first emotional memories, and I think this is part of the reason why I think it feels hard to broach things like the connections between anti-Semitism and other kinds of racisms, because it feels like people are relieved to be white. And I can understand that, right? It's a relief to be kind of exempted, briefly in terms of like the long historical scope of anti-Semitism from state violence, from persecutions, from pogroms. And there is a kind of sense that I get that if we just kind of if we're just good, and if we don't rock the boat, and if we don't ally ourselves with any other kind of others and admit that racisms against us are bound up with racisms against other minorities or people of colour, then our place in whiteness won't be threatened. And that's something that is really difficult to unseat, because given the live emotional memory of what it meant to be not white, that's a difficult conversation to broach. It's very necessary, of course, because those kinds of similar violences, not on the same scale perhaps, but similar kinds of dynamics of violences are going on all the time. We have a responsibility to draw those links between our own sort of historical sufferings and ones that are continually happening to us and which are happening to other people all across the world. But I think when we're talking about these kinds of things, we don't pay enough attention to just how recent and how traumatic these memories really are.
There's a really, really important point in there about the importance of speech acts and what they do. Too often, and this is a right-wing response to concerns like this, like this whole thing about snowflakes, or you're too quick to take offence, someone said some bad words and you're offended. It's got nothing to do with offence when it comes to racism. It's this fact that if people are using language that dehumanises you, that strips you of your humanity, or that presents you as a security threat or a threat to the nation, that opens up all sorts of possibilities in terms of how you can be treated. If society is encouraged to see you as a racialised other, as dehumanised, as dangerous, that opens the door. So take Brexit, official Leave campaign putting out this video saying the Turks are coming to get you. David Cameron's going to let in the Turks, and look at them. And then you turn to a video of supposedly the Turkish parliament and a fight going on, and then a map showing how easy it is to get from the Middle East into Turkey and then into Europe. So that's portraying brown people and racialised others, people from the Middle East, as a security threat to Britain, and that's put out by the official Leave campaign, Govan Johnson leading it. Same time you've got Nigel Farage with his Breaking Point poster. Look at this horde of dehumanised, faceless brown people who are all coming to get you. And then later on, a fascist, neo-fascist, kills in broad daylight. I don't know why we're not talking about this in British politics. It's such a significant event. In that context of racialised demagoguery coming from the official and unofficial Leave campaign and from the press, on the background of years of this stuff, a prominently pro-migrant MP is stabbed and shot to death in broad daylight by a neo-Nazi who then gives his name in court as Death to Traitors, Freedom for Britain. The traitor being the MP, who is a traitor to her race and her nation by letting in this security threat. So you can say, oh, are you offended by this video? Are you offended by this poster? No, I'm frightened by this video and by this poster, because it makes all sorts of things possible. And then, sorry, Paul Mason, if we're picking on you, but when Paul Mason after that, after the Brexit vote, says we need to think about having an emergency brake on immigration, that's horrifying to me as a person of colour who's scared enough genuinely after the vote, when I hear people of colour getting abused in the street, when my mum, who's very dark-skinned, goes out in an area which is UKIP voting, where we live, where my family live. I'm worried about her going out. And then someone who's supposed to be an ally talks about an emergency brake on immigration, as if the immigrants are the emergency. See, all this stuff, it's language, but it's language linked to violence, and language that makes violence possible. So, and I'm trying to draw a link here between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism, where if we, in the left, downplay and diminish speech acts that are anti-Semitic, we're being clueless about how this stuff works, because, for all the reasons you said.
Yeah, I think you're precisely right here, and particularly I'm glad you picked up on the issue of migration, because this is a particular talking point of the far right in terms of the way in which their anti-Semitism is characterised. It's because Jewish people are considered to be this kind of eternally internal but also external other. There's like continual fifth agents for all of the other kind of invasive forces that you can name in society. Yeah. And that's precisely the language that was called on by the shooter in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Jewish people had to be wiped out, had to be violently extinguished, not just because they were an existential threat in and of themselves, but because they were letting in this other kind of more dangerous and more directly violent existential threat, which was, what was it at the time? The migrant caravan, I think.
Yeah, from Honduras.
From Honduras. And this is why I feel like we continually need to connect these kinds of racisms, even though we can and must sort of tactically separate them off and treat them differently and treat them as kind of equally weighty, but we need to continually be talking about the fact that this is the same kind of issue, because it tends towards the same kind of systems of violence, right? And I'd like to talk a bit on that note about the ways in which Islamophobia and the particular character of the security threat as characterised in Islamophobia, particularly in the Tory party, is very convenient for their policy goals, right? I think it's we should be focusing on why they use Islamophobia in particular as a talking point. Because let's take a step back. The Tory party, as we all know, are invested in rolling out austerity, neoliberalism on steroids, to try and flog every last bit of our social and our economic and our material existences to the free market. And as predicted, that has led to a collapse in living standards. People are massively dispossessed. And as should be not surprising, that leads, generally speaking, to a lot of social unrest, as we saw in the 2011 uprisings, etc., etc. And so what that teaches us is that if you want to roll out, if you want to roll out neoliberalism, that also needs to be paired with extreme levels of policing and surveillance to try and tamp down on a population who you know is going to be restless, who you know is going to potentially kick off, because, you know, they've rightly had enough of these kind of social policies. When you need to do that, when you need to legitimise that sort of those methods of like vastly reactionary and illiberal policing and illiberal surveillance, it's very useful to have a not just a kind of a racial other on which you can scapegoat your own failings, but a particularly violent sort of interior other that is always at risk of being radicalized, is always demands policing, must always be surveilled, in order to justify those kinds of policies, right? Yeah. And the flip side of that is, of course, the kind of anti-black racism that we're seeing in a lot of coverage of knife crime, because that anti-black racism is precisely about rolling out the kind of policing that Boris Johnson and his ilk have been, salivating about for years now, and suddenly they have this bogeyman, right, of like the violent black youth who's completely farcical, completely racist as a stereotype, in order to justify their policies. And so we need to think about the particular characteristics of these different kinds of racisms and what they're doing and why they're particularly useful.
Yeah, definitely.
I want to have a brief, very practical conversation. So I think your point about speech acts, how we should take them seriously, not just as, oh, you're offended, so what? Which is where actually I do think that the left in the last couple of years has actually taken on the language of the right, because they've just sort of said, who cares if I've offended you? It's true. AIPAC AIPAC are the reason, and their money is the reason that America back Israel, and I don't care if it offends you because it's true. That's kind of what the right say about Muslims and paedophilia, for example. They say sort of like, yeah, right. I suppose what Sarah Champion would have said. She said
it's literally what she said.
Her argument was Britain has a problem with Muslim men raping white girls, and then she's
Pakistani men.
Pakistani men. Yeah. She's told that's racist. She's like, it's true. I don't care if I offend you. I'm here speaking truth. Yeah. Well, to power, I suppose. That's probably not the phrase she would have used.
But that's precisely the phrase she used. That's precisely the kind of idea of like this sort of takeover that like Muslim people have somehow taken the reins of the state, which is where there is again similarity between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, because it's both about the capture of the reins of like what is otherwise a totally justified set of strategic state powers by this other who then uses them for ill, right? Then Sarah Champion should absolutely be suspended. To
keep it practical though, so I mean, some of the incidents of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, I mean, that's not a practical question. If you believe that the Rothschilds control the world, I mean, fuck it.
Yeah. This isn't for
just
you.
Get out.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of good people in the Labour Party, people who I do think of as anti-racist, who genuinely care so much about the Palestinian struggle. They see day after day, like the most horrific state violence against what seems and basically is a powerless people, being racially suppressed, repressed, you know, on a day-to-day basis. And they're not sure how to talk about Israel. And I don't mean that in a patronizing way, because I don't mean, oh, they're stuck there, they don't know how to talk about it. What I mean is they don't know what they can say that won't get them attacked, so say by a factional opponent in the Labour Party. And I suppose the best way to have this conversation is, how do you have a conversation about Israel-Palestine where there aren't what you've called speech acts, which can further anti-Semitism, or, well, I mean, I suppose from the left it would normally be furthering anti-Semitism because it's pro-Israel and pro the Palestinian cause. So I don't know if either of you have comments on sort of like practical advice for how to talk about that particular struggle without slipping into a mode of speech that can further racism.
I mean, first of all, Judas has some really great material on this.
They're terrific.
JEWDAS on Twitter and all your socials, and it has precisely literature on how to talk about Israel from a pro-Palestinian perspective without stumbling across these tropes. And a lot of people do it who are, you know, totally well-intentioned, because there is this total dearth of education and of awareness around the sensitivities of these issues. But I think on a practical level, what we need to be doing is refusing to exceptionalize the Israeli state in the way that certain vested interests in terms of, you know, the US foreign policy, for instance, goals want us to. We should refuse to exceptionalize Israel in a way that is convenient, ultimately, for the goals of the Israeli state, and treat it as it is, aka like any other nation state, with a particular set of foreign and domestic goals which it justifies using the most convenient ideology, the most convenient superstructure in order to perpetuate those goals, right? And if we treat this as a kind of like a material set of relations and about preserving state power, and not about preserving the interests of any kind of one ethnic group, I think we should be off to a really good start, right? But I think where that becomes complicated is we do need to address and acknowledge the way in which the goals of the Israeli state are kind of have been captured, not just in terms of like a basically material set of, say, securing access to gas fields in the Levant, but is also bound up with an ethno-nationalist project, which we've seen with, for instance, recently, the nation-state laws, which is precisely about securing the supremacy of Jewish people, particularly of Ashkenazi origin Jewish people, over other kinds of ethnicities within Israel. But I think the answer is to look to the fact that this is not an exception in terms of the broad sweep of history. This happens all the time. Yeah. This is happening across the world. Yeah. And we have frameworks for discussing how to critique ethno-nationalist projects without tarring everyone from that ethnicity with the same brush and necessarily associating them with those ethno-nationalist projects. And yes, it's tricky, and yes, we have to be sensitive and maybe acknowledge that people will fuck up, and we need to address it very honestly and head on when they do. But yeah, I think why are we the reason why we get kind of so het up about this is precisely because of the Israeli state's sort of drive to exceptionalize itself when it's really not that much of a historical exception at all.
Well, I think the trickiest issue is Zionism, right? It's the trickiest in the sense that I don't really know what I think about it. Not in terms of what I think about Zionism, what I think about how one should be able to talk about it. So what lots of Jewish people who aren't anti-Zionists, who I've had this conversation with, say is that if you have a political party where Zionism is demonized, then you are creating a space which is unwelcome for Jews. And I've spoken to Palestinians who for them Zionism is anti-Palestinian racism, which it also is. So Zionism is both the desire of the Jewish people for a homeland where there's no chance that they're going to get racially persecuted, and it is sort of systematic racism against Palestinians, sort of by definition. I don't know how a left-wing party can navigate those two facts, I suppose.
We should be able to talk in nuance, shouldn't we? We should be capable of that. And again, I'll go back to Rachel Sher because I just think she's really good in some of this stuff. In that article she wrote, I think it was in September last year, she said, think about Zionism as being a response to anti-Semitism in Europe, a response to racism, and also acknowledge the fact that the way the Palestinian people have experienced the Zionist project is as a racist project that said that our desire for self-determination and our right to self-determination trumps yours. So we'll have our self-determination in our state at your expense. So from the Palestinian point of view, that's racism. But that can all you can recognise that how Palestinians have experienced the Zionist project, and also recognise that for the people who drove that project, the Jewish people who drove that project, there was to play it extremely mildly, a very legitimate fear. Both those things can be true, can't they?
Absolutely, and this is why I think you were gesturing towards a very good solution when you were talking about how Zionism is both these things, right? Because we can't talk about Zionism as a monolith, just in the way that we can't talk about feminism or anti-capitalism or whatever as a monolith, because it realistically is many different kinds of strains captured within that broad umbrella of Zionism. There is liberal Zionism, there is the kind of reactionary Zionism, there is the particular kind of Zionism as made manifest in the Israeli state today, which many other people who are also Zionists disagree with. But in order to, I think, contextualise this, it's important to acknowledge, as David was talking about, the origins of this, which is it comes out of massive anti-Semitism, particularly at the end of the 19th century, particularly in Northern Europe. But there were also Jewish critics of Zionism at the time, because they saw it as a form of nationalism, and there were a lot of socialist Jewish people who rightly observed that whilst they were persecuted as Jews, and whilst they suffered inordinately as Jews, they were also suffering inordinately as members of the working class and as women, as LGBT people. And to think that a separate nation state would deliver them out of all these forms of oppression was, to them, clearly farcical, because the state, they observed, is a bourgeois project about enshrining bourgeois capitalist relations. This is what the Bund was saying. And so what they prescribed instead was this idea of daenu, being here, being here-ness. It's a really cat-handed translation. I apologise to Yiddish speakers out there. But the idea that the struggle for self-determination doesn't just need to be a struggle for national separatism. It's about having a deeper, more complex understanding of what self-determination means for a Jewish people who refuse to see themselves as necessarily nationally separate from the places where they were born, from the places that they grew up in and that they were still, emotionally attached to, which is particularly bound up with the fact that the struggle against capitalism and all these other forms of oppression, which are bound up with the struggle against anti-Semitism, cannot be resolved by having a separate state. So when people are saying like, oh, you don't support Jewish self-determination, I absolutely do, in the way that I support any kind of other self-determination, aka as a cosmopolitan collaborative project that doesn't involve siloing people off into different ethno-nationalist groups, which can't help but devolve into violence.
Yeah. Can you have because I think this is the crux of the question, I suppose, in terms of, because I agree, and I think that's a useful way of looking at it in terms of it's racist from the perspective of the Palestinians, and it's a safe haven from the perspective of the Jews, particularly in the context in which it was created.
Anti-racist from that perspective.
Yeah, and anti-racist from that perspective. And I mean, the Holocaust had just happened. And
plenty of other stuff had happened before.
But the issue, sort of like where I've come up with something that's hard to get across, is Zionism essentially always ethno-nationalist? Because to come to terms with Zionism, and I think there are lots of reasons to come to terms with Zionism, one has to come to terms that it's possible to have a justifiable form of ethno-nationalism?
See, I don't think there's ever a justifiable form of ethno-nationalism, right? Because you are at some point going to end up having to expel or suppress or whatever, ethnic minorities, right? But it comes down to an issue as whether you see Zionism as kind of broadly captured this orientation towards a Jewish homeland as necessarily an ethno-nationalist project, and I don't see why that has to be the case, right? There's no necessary reason to say that, like, oh, having a home means that no one else can live there is, completely bananas to me.
Do you have to defend a Jewish majority? So that would be the crux issue, right? So if an ethno-nationalist state means that you have to, as a form of state policy, maintain a majority of people from a particular ethnicity.
Absolutely, but I'm saying that, like, it's not necessarily contained within the idea of Zion. Ethno-nationalism isn't necessarily contained within the idea of Zionism, because, as I say, there are many other forms of Zionism, and there are many ways of articulating what it means to live in a homeland. I wouldn't characterize myself as a Zionist at all, but I wouldn't necessarily, if someone came up to me and said, that they were a Zionist, I wouldn't necessarily, say that, like, oh, you're an ethno-nationalist, then, because it's more complicated than that.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, nationalism has a relation to power, doesn't it? And sometimes nationalism is a response to oppression. Global South nationalisms have been, in 19th and 20th centuries, have been responses to oppression. And nationalism can also be nationalism of the powerful, and suddenly it becomes very chauvinistic, and there's not necessarily a really hard dividing line between the two. Like, you can morph from one to another, like Arab nationalism vis-a-vis Western power vis-a-vis the expulsion of the Palestinians can be a emancipatory project potentially, unless you're a Kurd living in an Arab nationalist state and you're wondering, how do I fit into Ba'athist Syria? How do I fit into Ba'athist Iraq? So I think thinking about ethno-nationalism in those terms perhaps can be useful, so we can have a degree of sympathy and understanding for why people are drawn to that, and understanding in terms of the historical circumstances why people are drawn to it, but also an understanding of just the inherent problems with nationalism, that you can get drawn towards a form of chauvinism that can be domineering if it's given power.
We should go to audience questions, I think. But first of all, thank you for watching Tiski Sour. As ever, this show is only possible, Novara Media is only possible because of your kind monthly subscriptions. So if you already subscribe, thank you. If you don't, our ask is for, ideally, the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, so we can continue working around the clock. We have around 600 people watching. I want this to go up, so please share this on Facebook and Twitter. Please give it a like, because that means it appears in more people's YouTube news feeds, if that's a thing. I don't know. It appears in more people's YouTube page when they go on YouTube.
Technical whiz here.
Yeah, technical whiz here. I'm not the tech guy. So give me your questions. I mean, there have been a number of questions that I've sort of been clocking as we go. So while you're typing, I'll bring back some of those. So I think a really confusing dynamic, I suppose, is one way to put it, in terms of how this anti-Semitism row has developed, is that there's often been claims that a Jewish person has been anti-Semitic. And many of the people, so say Chris Williamson, for example, he was defending, I'm pretty sure he was defending a Jewish person. So that's very confusing, So
Tell me about it.
So to one, not deny the extent of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic speech acts in the Labour Party, whilst there are many Jewish people saying there aren't, these speech acts aren't anti-Semitic. I don't know, it's a difficult question. I don't know if anyone has an answer they want to put forward.
I mean, I have a confusing situation that I would like to offer. So, someone who, this is months ago, someone reported me for anti-Semitism for, I can't remember what precisely it was, but it was some kind of criticism of Israel. And then recently, someone from Labour Against Anti-Semitism called me a black shirt for criticising Ian Austin for being a racist, which he was, and I've reported them. So it's like a really fun game of cat and mouse that we're all, exhaustedly getting wound up in. But in in that, I think there needs to be attention to the fact that, like with any other kind of protected category, you know, othered group, if you like, we all grew up in a society which hands us the wonderful gift of racism in all its forms, and anti-Semitism and sexism and all these kinds of things. So we're all kind of unlearning this stuff. So being of a particular minority does not necessarily exempt you from being prejudiced against that minority, right? Because we're all going to stumble across these things sort of occasionally. However, I think the particular worrying facet of this is the urge precisely to single out Jewish people for particular criticism, to divide people into categories of good Jews and bad Jews, which is a notorious right-wing tactic, because it's the thin end of the wedge to justifying wider discriminatory policies. Because once you've divided a minority into good and bad, then you can say, okay, we've got these policies, but they're only targeting the bad bits of the minorities, and you know, the good people are protected. And obviously that's, you know, going a total canard, it's a total sham, and it is the thin end of the wedge, as I was saying. And I think that's what we need to be paying attention to, not just the fact that, it seems absurd that Jewish people are also being targeted and called anti-Semitic, but why Jewish people in particular are being singled out for scrutiny by a right-wing agenda which is longing to divide people into good and bad Jews, and an agenda which is being very disappointingly taken up and reflected by some members of the left, who are saying that, like, the only legitimate Jewish people are Jewish people who are critical of Israel, which is farcical and also a dead end, because Jewish people should be deserving of protection irrespective of their political views. That's what human rights are, right?
There's an element sometimes in the left of, look, I've found a Jewish person to exonerate me. So,
yeah.
You know, and it's Gilad Atzmon, but, you know, he's Jewish and he's exonerated me,
yeah.
so it's all fine. And here's a good example of this. People internalise racism. People within minorities internalise racism because, again, it's a social construct, and it's there in the discourse, it's there in the dominant ideology, and we can reproduce it against ourselves. Look at Sajid Javid basically expelling this young woman.
Yeah.
That's a racist act, and it's a brown person who did it.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're going to talk about racism beyond speech acts, but in terms of structures, in terms of policy, look at our whole counter-terrorist, counter-extremism, counter-radicalisation apparatus and sets of policies, just shot through with racism and producing again and again these racist outcomes. We've got a brown Home Secretary sat at the top of that structure, managing it, and who likes it and who's happy with it. And frankly, throughout those structures, in the police and the security services and in the Home Office, you will find brown people, you know. And these are people who are either internalising racist discourses or reproducing racist policies. And we have to be able to sort of handle that complexity, I think, that people will internalise this stuff.
Which is precisely why we need to focus on, you know, educating people about the structural elements of this. Because as you were saying earlier, of course, this is not an individual pathology. That's not how... this is not how these kind of prejudices propagate themselves. It's not how they sustain themselves. And, you know, part of the function of, you know, a structure of any kind of discrimination is that it doesn't matter who's pulling the strings, because it is the simple fact of the operation of those laws which produces the unjust outcome, and not the person who's operating it. Again, I mean, similarly, you know, women have been roundly discriminated against and are by this administration, and are bearing the brunt of austerity. They are picking up the slack for the social crisis, and we have the second ever woman prime minister. You know, it's nonsense to think that we can reduce these problems down to the individual moral agency
Yeah.
of individual people, because then you can call it solved when you have, you know, female faces in high places or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think an important one is that if you're talking about a form of oppression, then if someone is of the identity affected, that is definitely reason to give added weight to what they say and to listen closely.
For sure.
But it's not a reason to accept it as gospel, because that would be completely logically impossible, because people say different things.
Yeah.
And you also can't do it based on the majority. So last summer I spent a lot of time advocating that Labour shouldn't adopt IRA, because I thought it silenced Palestinian people. One of the arguments for IRA was that most of the mainstream Jewish organisations want Labour to adopt it. And so my argument there would be that, yes, because most of the mainstream Jewish organisations want Labour to adopt it, we should definitely take what they're saying very seriously. We should take it much more seriously than if the Conservative Tea Drinking Association had said it, because you know they're affected by this. But that doesn't mean, well, ultimately what you have to do is you have to make decisions based on what you think is right. So you're sort of giving privileged weight to someone because of their identity, but you can't say, well, this Jewish person said it, so it can't be anti-Semitic. It doesn't work like that.
And I think it's about it's not even about weighting what they say, sort of like giving them extra brownie points when you're listening to them, right? It's about acknowledging that these people will have a certain kind of knowledge which is maybe not available to the public sphere, because it's the kind of knowledge that only comes by living through a certain experience, right? It's embodied, and yes, it seems, if you don't have those kinds of embodied knowledges, it feels like it's completely flawed, fruitless, kind of giving extra credit for no reason just because you're part of a certain identity. But, you know, actually it's about acknowledging that these kinds of lived realities are a fundamental way in which politics and power expresses itself, and these need to be part of the public conversation. But as you're saying, they're not the whole of it.
Another excellent question. Ian Bagshaw: are the terms institutionally racist and sickeningly anti-Semitic justifiably applicable to the Labour Party? And please discuss the synonymous words around institutional and widespread. I'm not quite sure about the second part of that. So I think it's very interesting to discuss, is institutionally racist and sickeningly anti-Semitic the same thing? And is Labour institutionally racist?
So institutional racism, we're talking about the behaviour of an institution. So we call an institution institutionally racist. We're not saying every member of that organisation is racist. We're not even necessarily saying a majority of members of that organisation are racist. What we're saying is that the outcomes of the decisions and actions of that organisation are experienced by a certain group in a racist way. So I think if Jewish people have experienced Labour's disciplinary process against anti-Semites in a way that is just consistently
not up to scratch,
suboptimal, to put it really, really fucking mildly, then, you know, I don't like to say it, but maybe Labour is institutionally racist. If that's how they've experienced it, then, you know, and that doesn't mean the majority of Labour Party members are racist. It doesn't even mean that half or even a large minority of Labour members are racist. I don't want to put a figure on it, but, you know, it's not really about that. It's about how the organisation has behaved. And it's just documented that the disciplinary process hasn't been working properly.
I think I want to invite people to consider what we gain in denying that a party is institutionally racist or institutionally anti-Semitic, because if we have this ability to expel all anti-Semites, that doesn't actually mean that we have a party that is capable of tackling racism, because in order to tackle racism we also need to tackle racism within our own ranks, right? We need to be able to educate people, to build coalitions between people who might come into the project with like really objectionable ideas, but who then can be educated and convinced of the necessity, the political necessity of these kinds of solidarities, right? And if we are to build that kind of project is only going to come if we admit the depths of its failure. So yes, I think Labour is institutionally anti-Semitic. I think it's institutionally Islamophobic as well. That doesn't mean it's a project that should be abandoned. It means that it was a project forged in the heart of British state power, and it's forged to try and like take on the reins of British state power, which are also institutionally racist in all kinds of ways, and we need to be admitting those flaws in order to be able to tackle them. And I think the urge to say that like no, anti-Semitism is impossible, we are an anti-racist party, is ahistorical, is dangerous, and it's a dereliction of duty. Not least because that will fall on deaf ears if you're trying to persuade a lot of the Jewish people who have been alienated from the project that you're actually taking their concerns seriously. And it shouldn't be about saying that like, oh, you know, we're just being smeared in the press, because of course we're being smeared in the press, right? Rupert Murdoch has no interest in delivering a socialist government. So we shouldn't be quibbling about like why we're being smeared or if we're being smeared. We should be taking these, you know, these things as a challenge to honestly reconcile ourselves with the very flawed, very troubled history of labour movements which have been sexist, racist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, ableist, everything you want to name. Because that's how we start building something better. And that's where Corbynism came from. Corbynism didn't come from like denying the flaws of the Labour Party. It came from saying the Labour Party is deeply flawed, and that's precisely the reason why we need good people and well-intentioned people who are prepared to learn and prepared to fight for it.
On that institutional racism point, and just to draw out what you're saying, let's be absolutely clear, the British political class is institutionally racist, and it's been institutionally racist for centuries.
Yeah.
The British state is institutionally racist and has been institutionally racist for centuries. And I'm not saying that to deflect from the issues of Labour, it's to contextualise it, you know. And it is also really important. One of the things that's been really frustrating, and again this is not to deflect, but it is important, over the last few months, is the right wing of the Labour Party, the Fleet Street and the Tory Party all presenting themselves as principled opponents of racism, who are horrified, shocked to find this racism within the Labour Party. And people saying, oh, this proud party with its history of anti-racism, I mean, come off it, has suddenly become racist out of nowhere, and we are all, you know, in principle against this. I mean, for a person of colour who grew up in this country, experiencing the racism that these people created and perpetuated, for all of us people of colour and people of black and minority ethnic background who've been scarred by this stuff, the last couple of years in those terms have just felt like this epic exercise in gaslighting. Did we imagine all that? You know, so you've got racism, institutionalised racism coming through empire, through slavery, through the whole ideology of especially enlightened either Anglo-Saxon race or British culture or whatever, bringing civilization to the backward people of the earth, institutionalised racism in terms of immigration legislation coming out of the Labour Party and the Tory Party, institutionalised racism coming out in more recent years in terms of this relentless return to the dog whistle, this legitimate concerns about the rate of change in communities, this kind of, you know, those kind of tropes and language which gloss racism and rehabilitate racism, the institutional racism of the counter-radicalisation and counter-extremism apparatus, which we talked about, which was created by Labour and the Tories, you know. Racism is just core to British life. It's core to British political discourse. It's core to the mainstream sense of what Britain is vis-a-vis, in contradistinction to or in relation to the rest of the world. It's just it's there. And again, I'm not saying it to deflect. I'm saying if we're going to understand British racism properly, then we can't allow the mainstream of British politics to use this anti-Semitism crisis within Labour to whitewash itself. You know, I'm not having that. I'm not watching them do this. It's too much.
But then, how do you? So you sort of started the show, or much earlier in the show, was saying how you don't like how the anti-Semitism row within the Labour Party has been sort of turned around to say, well, actually, the establishment is racist. So how would you? How would you do what you've just explained doing without it being a sort of whataboutism.
My problem is with this particularly, and I find it just a little bit facile, this kind of, okay, we've got individual racists within our ranks, you know, with their individual racist pathology and their individual offensive language, but look at them in that party, they've got the same but more. I'm saying let's have a bigger discussion about what racism looks like in British society, and rather than talking about Tory Islamophobia in terms of members versus Labour anti-Semitism in terms of members, let's talk about what anti-Semitism, Islamophobia and racism generally, how they really manifest themselves, and how it's not just, why are we talking about Islamophobia within the Tories as members? What about Tory policy, you know, prevent and all this? Why are we talking about Islamophobia just in terms of the Tory party, when we could talk about Fleet Street, we could talk about Labour, the way Labour under Corbyn didn't discipline Sarah Champion. Under Corbyn, they didn't sack Sarah Champion for going to the Sun, as if she wants to have a constructive discussion about racism in the Sun, goes to the Sun and writes an article saying we've got a problem with British Pakistani women. Was that politically incorrect? Well, I've said it anyway. Legitimising the language of the far right, and Corbyn doesn't sack her. I think if we're going to talk about Islamophobia, let's not just talk about Islamophobia to point the finger at the Tory party. Let's really talk about it, including in our own party.
And as like someone from a Jewish background, it has been roundly depressing and dispiriting to watch this kind of macabre pantomime by which people who have absolutely no investment in any kind of like restitution or racial justice really, using the currency of a kind of particularly flattened, shallow, whitened interpretation of what anti-Semitism is, in order to kind of launder their own like deeply morally corrupt position within British public discourse, which forces people to, you know, obviously choose sides, right? And even though we need to be taking these kinds of challenges to get our own house in order, if you like, seriously, and using them as opportunities to go, well, actually, this isn't a problem of, you know, a few Tories saying Islamophobic things. This is a problem of Islamophobia being, you know, one of the guiding foundational logics of the modern British state. We also need to be, as part of that conversation, trying to shift away from the Murdoch press and Fleet Street and all that being the moral arbiters of that debate. And I think we do that simply by talking honestly, because yes, you know, they might run an article on how a singular Tory politician has said something Islamophobic, but they will absolutely never run the kind of consistent critiques of the British state that are really needed, right? Yeah. That are the first step to any kind of justice. So we kind of reclaim that moral authority, not by denying the fact that there's a problem, but by deepening the conversations and by talking about it freaking honestly, right?
Yeah. I just want to return to the question, because I think it was actually really usefully phrased, which is to say, are the terms institutionally racist and sickeningly anti-Semitic justifiably applicable to the Labour Party? Because I think precisely the problem is that whenever this question has been asked, it's been interpreted as sickeningly anti-Semitic. So you get a Labour MP who's asked, do you think that the Labour Party is institutionally anti-Semitic? And they say, well, if it was institutionally anti-Semitic, I wouldn't be in it. And it's all like, you've been in probably an institutionally racist party your whole life. But that doesn't mean but that Labour is institutionally anti-Semitic, which I think at the moment on that definition, which is that it's not providing a non-discriminatory service to a particular group of people. And I think that's for the same reasons that I think the left have failed on anti-Semitism, which is not so much the left is full of anti-Semites, but full of people who turn a blind eye to anti-Semitism.
Yeah, full of denial.
They habitually
full of denial and bunker mentality. Yeah. There's a tiny proportion of people who are actually anti-Semitic. But there's a much larger group of people who are just belligerently defensive in a really mindless way. That's the big problem.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the fear with Labour is that they don't want to, because you're in a competitive political system. If they say, look, we hold our hands up, we're institutionally anti-Semitic, they're going to see that as sort of like giving more ammo to the right wing press.
Yeah, but it's not just a tribal battle. Like, we've got obligations to our Jewish brothers and sisters that go beyond tribal battles.
Yeah. Also, it means that, like, because there's this bunker mentality, and because there is this total dearth of spaces in which these questions can be confronted honestly, we're setting up this dynamic whereby, you know, if people want to honestly raise concerns about their experiences of anti-Semitism within the party or within the left more generally, they're seen as somehow treacherous, which is itself anti-Semitic, right? Because you are siding with the smears or whatever, and that's the kind of dynamic that we're perpetuating. And that's the frustrating thing, is that is precisely the kind of dynamic which is so convenient, right? It's so convenient that this should be a reason for kind of loads and loads of splits. And this is also a reason why I think the charge of, like, oh, the Tories are Islamophobic is kind of weak in comparison, because you do have a lot of, you know, committed anti-racists within the Labour Party who will take these seriously, and who are, you know, rightly very frustrated about the ways in which these debates roll out. And this is why we're getting all kinds of fractures at the moment.
Right,
we don't have that in the Tory party. If you were to go to the average, you know, Conservative Party member and say your party is Islamophobic, they'd be like, it doesn't have the same weight. So I don't know why we're kind of doing this like tu quoque thing, because it's not going to work.
Let's wrap up, I think. It's almost 9:30.
Good
That was
Lord.
a very interesting, often challenging chat. Eleanor, before we go, you want to talk about the women's strike, which is this Friday, right?
I do. So where am I looking?
Which is your camera? I don't know.
Which is my camera?
I presume it's the one straight in front of you, Eleanor.
Hello. Let's go back a sec. I'm not a professional at this. Women's strike. Woo! Let's go. On Friday, which is International Women's Day, women across the world are going on strike from paid work and from unpaid caring domestic work to highlight the importance of this work, which is done largely by women and largely for free, this work on which our entire society and economy is founded. And by going on strike, we are showing the power of this work. We're showing that if we stop, the world stops. And we're doing this to demand gender justice. There are separate actions for the decriminalisation of sex work, for a fairer deal for mothers and female carers, and there are actions all across the UK, in London, Leeds, Liverpool, I am going to get this right, Brighton, Bristol, Cardiff and Edinburgh. So if you're anywhere near those areas, get involved. And if you're not anywhere near those areas, you can go on strike yourself. You can organise your own strike. And the way to do that, the way to get involved, is to go say hello to us. You can catch us on Twitter at women_strike. You can also go to www.womenstrike.org.uk. And if you are not in the UK, there are many other actions around the world. So get involved. And if you are not a woman or a feminized gender, you can support it by supporting the women in your life by taking some freaking work off their hands for once, all right? See you on the streets.
That was very professionally done.
Thank you.
Thank you, David Waring, for joining us. Always a pleasure. Thank you,
you.
Eleanor Penny.
Thank
Always
you.
a pleasure. Thank you for watching Tiski Sour. As ever, to make this possible, please go to support.novaramedia.com. And our request is the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. That means you'll get a notification every time we go live. It's also good for our numbers, you know, it makes us feel good. Like the video, that means more people see it. And share it, because we want more people to be absorbing the left-wing vibes of Novara Media. This was Tiski Sour. We are Novara Media. Good night.